An important ethnographic film that can be situated between observational cinema and advances in post-observational ethnographic filmmaking concerned with the epistemology of knowing the world through the image, as well as developments in fields like semiotics, is Timothy Ash and Napoleon Chagnon's The Axe Fight from 1975. Part of a series of films about the Yanomamo Indians in Venezuela, the film combines raw images, that is, images caught on the fly and without any preparation or foreknowledge, with that same footage later recontextualized by way of voiceover explanation and interpretation about what in fact was actually happening in the apparent chaos and complexity of intratribal violence. In the filmmaker's self-reflexive willingness to return to and reinvestigate the footage, the limitations of mere observation are revealed, and the complexity and even ambiguity of the social world and the ethnographer's implication within it are possibly explored. For many scholars and ethnographers, the axe fight marks the decisive point where ethnographic film could no longer self-consciously operate with epistemological certainty or any assumptions of neutrality and non-intervention. Here is a clip from the opening of the film.
February 28th, 1971, afternoon, 10 minutes after 3. Two women are fighting with each other. Bring your camera over here. It's going to start.
This footage would then be replayed with voiceover analysis provided by anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, providing a contextualization of the events that have transpired. Paul Henley has recently summarized that the revelation and foregrounding of the axe fight's internal contradictions, for his part, signaled what he argues was the end of the road for the legacy of, quote, event-based documentation filmmaking that stemmed not just from Margaret Mead, but from Haddon and Spencer in the earliest days of ethnographic filmmaking. This type of shift and problematic can be further understood as a development in post-observational ethnographic film, where the process-driven aspects of observational cinema became increasingly dialogical and participation-oriented. That is, if observational cinema's combination of the subjective and objective left open the possibility of ambiguity and or multiple points of view, participation-driven post-observational film mobilizes a process in which the filmmaker not only observes his or her ethnographic subjects, but comes to confront and collaborate with them in the film event itself as a social process. One of the most influential and critically discussed works to emerge from the post-observational moment is Saul Worth and John Ader's Navajo Film Themselves film series, released in 1972, in which, as Worth and Ader explain in their book Through Navajo Eyes, published to accompany the film, the objective was, quote, to determine whether we could teach people with a culture different from ours to make motion pictures depicting their culture and themselves as they saw fit. Faye Ginsberg has argued that Navajo Film Themselves helped, quote, expand the classic paradigm of ethnographic film of us always filming them, unquote. In reconfiguring the situated political dynamics of ethnographic process as participation, then, the Navajo Film Themselves series can be seen as an important contribution to Ruch's shared anthropology, as well as an early example of what is now commonly referred to as indigenous media. Alongside the creation of anthropological meaning with the objects of knowledge, thus reconstituting them as co-subjects, Worth and Ader, again like Ruch, sought to remake anthropology as a visual and filmic medium, one that overcame the prioritization of words or text over the visual, as well as the embodied and the experiential. That said, the Navajo Film Themselves series and others like it have their critics. For instance, Brian Winston argues that Worth and Ader made a fatal error in their naive application of cinematic technology as a neutral recording device. They, quote, failed to see the camera as a culturally determined artifact in itself, so that whatever culturally specific documentation Worth and Ader thought they were helping to produce by providing the Navajo peoples with training and cameras was in fact already circumscribed by Western representational codes inscribed into the very materiality of the apparatus, such as the lenses designed according to the specifics of Renaissance perspective and a color system that favors Caucasian skin tones. For her part, post-colonial feminist theoretician and filmmaker Trinh T. Minhha blasts Worth and Ader for the way they self-righteously posited their work as teaching or giving opportunity to the Navajo peoples, all the while disavowing but relying on what she calls their white authority. Minha's critique here intersects with her broader project, outlined in her seminal essay, The Totalizing Quest of Meaning, of challenging the appeals to science in, quote, the sanctified terrain of anthropology, unquote, which was founded upon and driven by a colonial hierarchy that privileges the Western individual, invariably male, as the subject of knowledge, while positioning all others as objects to be known in a totalized system of visibility. Minha's critique would also find expression in what can be called her counter-ethnographic films, such as Reassemblage from 1983, shot among the people of rural Senegal, which, as Bill Nichols has observed approvingly, provides a postmodern meta-commentary on the anthropological unconscious operative in traditional ethnographic film subject positioning, itself based on value-laden notions and signifiers like here and there. The post-colonial critique of ethnographic film emerging in the 1980s would set itself to the task of deconstructing and revising many of the assumptions that informed observational cinema or what it would come to call observationalism or visualism. As this was going on, a contemporaneous set of questions and concerns was emerging in anthropology more generally regarding ethnography as a mode of writing, in particular as a kind of literary genre replete with its own conventions and rhetorics, often employing visual metaphors built around an ideological notion of observation. Associated with anthropologists and cultural theorists like Clifford Geertz, James Clifford, George Marcus, Johann Fabian, and Michael Taussig, among others, this critical turn heralded a crisis of representation that was referred to under the loose name of writing culture. A much-cited 1986 collection of critical and theoretical texts on the stakes of knowledge related to ethnographic writing as a practice intimately connected to the politics of colonialism. The work of Trinh T. Minhha and the writing culture critique presented an opportunity to rethink the simplistic dichotomy established in anthropological thought and practice around the terms image and word and how they function, as Peter Ian Crawford explains in, quote, ethnographic writing and filming, or rather, between textual and cinematic anthropology. The focus on representation emphasizes the relativity of the ethnographic enterprise as a kind of textual knowledge production linked to conventions of generic and narrative tropes. Crawford thus also elects Minha's Reassemblage as a paradigmatic text for understanding the shift in filmic ethnography from representation to evocation, what he refers to as a knowing, ironic transformation from the conventions of the fly on the wall, including observation, subtitles, interviews, and so forth, to a textual politics of the fly in the eye, meaning disjunctive montage, collage, ironic modes of address, overt aestheticization, and so forth. In the voiceover to Reassemblage, Minhha presents her anti-authoritative position in terms of not intending to speak about, but to speak nearby her subjects. So Reassemblage, Trin's 1982 meta or deconstructive ethnographic film, is a montage of fleeting images from Senegal and includes almost no narration save for the occasional statements by Trin, but none of which attempts to assign meaning in a conventional sense to many of the seconds-long shots, where one expects an omniscient scientific voiceover to override the moving pictures and overlay a mapping schema of meaning as per the traditional ethnographic film. There is sometimes music and sometimes no sound, the overt omission of sound. And in this way, Trin refuses to make the film be about something. She refuses to speak about the images, and she denies the hopeful Western observer the opportunity to categorize, to save, as it were, an other culture. And so the viewer is left with a sense of disorientation in that no distinct, final, or totalizing meaning is assigned to or drawn from any of the images in the film, and yet the trained ethnographic film viewer is constantly expecting such designations. And so, as Trinh T. Minhha has written in her article, Don't Stop in the Dark, on page 168, she says that form and content are inseparable in my work, for they are both equally historical and plastic. Here, reality in its social and historical dimensions is not a material for artistic reflection or political commitment. It is what powerfully draws one to cinema and yet cannot be captured without dissolving itself in its fragile essence when one approaches it without subtlety and vulnerability. As stated in Reassemblage, but realized in all aspects of my film practice, I do not intend to speak about, only to speak nearby. And so this sense of reality that Trin is getting at here is one that is not one that can, in a sense, be approached directly. It is one that can be only approached, as it were, from an oblique angle, from in a peripheral way, on the margins, and exploring the margins or interstitial spaces or transcultural spaces. And we can also see this in Surname Viet, given name Nam, released in 1988, which also highlights the aesthetic dimensions of the ethnographic enterprise, or the documentary enterprise more generally, and in its images. And here images of Vietnamese women reflecting on the social conditions of being a woman and being a mother are developed and explored and deconstructed in terms of their experience of contemporary Vietnam and then their intercultural experience with relative to the United States of America, where Trinh Minhha grew up and currently lives and works. And as she puts it, as Minh-ha puts it in her interview with Nancy N. Chen, she writes, or she states, language is at the same time a site for empowerment and a site for enslavement, and it is particularly enslaving when its workings remain invisible. Now, how one does bring that out in a film, for example, is precisely what I have tried to do in Surname Viet, given name Nam. This is an aspect of the film that highly differentiates it, let's say, from Reassemblage. If in the latter, that is, in Reassemblage, the space of language and meaning is constantly interrupted or effaced by the gaps of nonsenses, absences, and silences, in Surname Viet, this space is featured manifestly as presences, albeit presences positioned in the context of a critical politics of interview and translation. So just to very quickly unpack that here, the exploration of language in Surname Viet, both spoken language, written language, but also the language of the ethnographic film, the language of the documentary film, its styles and forms and techniques. This is explored in Surname Viet through these, what she calls presences, right? The presence, the sort of highlighting of what it is to conduct the aesthetic qualities and aspects of conducting an interview and of translating one language into another, of translating Vietnamese into English, of translating an emotional experience into something, a singular emotional experience into something shareable, of translating one culture into another cultural experience, of working inside of this intercultural gap, or this transcultural gap, or this transcultural space. This is what Trinh gets at in her essay, Don't Stop in the Dark, on page 171, when she writes that rather than having difference treated as mere conflict, in my work, difference comes with the art of spacing and is creatively transcultural. And here trans is not merely a movement across separate entities and rigid boundaries, but one in which the traveling is the very place of dwelling, and vice versa. And leaving is a way of returning home, to one's most intimate self. Cultural difference is not a matter of accumulating or juxtaposing several cultures whose boundaries remain intact. The crossing required in the transcultural undermines fixed notions of identity and border and questions culture in its specificity and its very formation. And so one of the key points here that Trinh is getting at is that it's not simply about bringing together what we might have conceived of as these sort of closed, coherent, singular cultures, as if their boundaries were always assumed to be secure. It is in fact to show us in these sort of transcultural spacings and interactions, we actually see the permeability, the mediality, the becoming, the unfolding, the ever ongoing movement of every culture is revealed. So it is not simply, as she says, to bring these distinct cultures together as if they were, entities unto themselves. It is to actually reveal how they are always already kind of in formation, as she puts it, right? They're always constantly moving, and this is why she would argue that, why Trinh would argue that to leave is in fact a way of returning. To really actually understand and get at one's own culture in its kind of unfolding and becoming and transformation, one has to also enter into dialogue and exchange with another culture in this kind of spacing, as she puts it. Okay, so let's turn very quickly to our 4 questions and discussion topics. The first is that, according to James Clifford, who I quoted early on in this lecture, the salvage paradigm sets up a binary or unequal relationship between so-called advanced Western culture and its underdeveloped, as it were, others or non-Western cultures? Are there examples of the salvage paradigm operative in contemporary culture and contemporary cultural discourses today? Is there a relationship between the salvage paradigm, as Clifford understands it, and cultural appropriation, as we define it today? So we could think about that. Second, observational cinema, cinema verite, handheld cameras going out into the field, no commentary on what is being shot, all of this sort of business, was once one of the dominant forms of ethnographic and documentary film, and arguably it is still quite popular and dominant or integrated into documentary forms and styles today, of course. So how have documentary filmmakers, artists, and or critics challenged the classical paradigm and truth claims, the epistemology, right, of observational cinema? How has the practice of observational cinema continued into the present? What are some of its current social and political uses, meanings, and values? So we could think of some examples here. Third, in her essay, The Totalizing Quest Meaning, Trinh Minhha argues that, quote, in the quest for totalized meaning and for knowledge's sake, the worst meaning is meaninglessness, unquote. What is the function of meaninglessness in Trin's critique of the traditional documentary film or ethnographic film and its claims to totality? What is her goal in this critique of meaning and totality? And finally, what role does self-reflexivity have in this critique of knowledge for knowledge's sake? And this takes us, in a way, it's related to our final question, which is to consider the role of the aesthetic in Trinh T. Minha's practice, in particular the two films that we discussed. So we can discuss how Reassemblage, or Surname Viet, Given Name Nam, expressly highlight the role of the aesthetic, including the length of shots, the role of wide shots or close-ups, for example, editing and montage, available and artificial or studio lighting, and available or field sound and voiceover in the construction of knowledge about the world and so-called other cultures. Right, so what is the role of the aesthetic in this? And we, as I already pointed out, if reassemblage is a kind of collage and montage that highlights its kind of this sort of interruptions and gaps and spaces of nonsense, then we can also then think about how Surname Viet, Given Name Nam is actually about the presence of the interview, the presence of language, the presence of mediation. So rather than gaps and cuts and juxtapositions, it is about highlighting and self-reflexively reflecting on, as it were, the conditions in which these different documentary subjects, the Vietnamese women and mothers, are speaking in the film. So I look forward to discussing all of this with you, both on Canvas in the discussion forum, as well as in our chat on Friday at 2 p.m. Thank you.